Hello everyone, and welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies webinar on the topic of energy security. My name is Karl Williams. I'm a Senior Researcher at the CPS, and I'm going to be chairing this discussion today. Before I introduce our panellists, and we've got three fantastic speakers lined up for you today, I'm just going to set out what the next hour is going to look like, and go into a bit of the background to this, set the scene a little bit. We'll begin with opening remarks from each of our speakers, for about 5 minutes each. And after that, we'll move on to a more general discussion based around the key points that emerge from those opening remarks. And then about halfway through, we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. So if you're watching on YouTube or Zoom, you can start asking questions right away, put them in the comments, we'll collate them up, and then we'll be ready to go in about half an hour. So, energy security, price shocks, geopolitical threats. These are clearly issues that have been rising up the agenda for some time now, since last autumn. However, it's the Ukraine, of course, the Ukraine crisis that's really brought this into focus. As those of you who read the Centre for Policy Studies New Economic Bulletin already know, Russia accounts for about 38% of Europe's gas, about 23% of its oil, and a further 21% of its coal. So it really is a massive factor in the energy equation. So it's against this backdrop that the government has announced announced plans to reveal a new energy security strategy. Now, we were expecting it this week. It doesn't think that's going to happen. But no matter, because that means our panelists can extemporize and tell us what they think should be in the strategy and what they hope it will look like when we eventually get eyes on it. So without further ado, I will introduce the panelists. So first up, we're going to hear from Peter Aldous, the Member of Parliament for Waveney, which he's represented since, I think, 2010. Now, Peter is a veteran of various all-party parliamentary groups on topics in energy, hydro, nuclear, low energy prices, North Sea oil and gas. So an immense amount of expertise and experience he's going to bring to bear on this. After Peter, we're going to hear from Jess Ralston. Jess is a senior analyst at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, a think tank focused on questions in the energy space and the energy transition. So obviously, again, incredibly relevant to the issues we're discussing today. And then finally, we're going to hear from Adam Bell. Adam is the head of policy at Stonehaven, a consultancy. And in a previous life, he worked at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So again, a third speaker who's really going to be on top of the policy detail in this area. So on that note, can I hand over to you, Peter, to get the ball rolling?
Well, many thanks and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Aldous MP for Waveney and Suffolk, and probably where I come from does give some sort of clue about what my views are as to where we should be going, because East Anglian coast, we obviously had the oil and gas industry, extraction of hydrocarbons on the UKCS now going on for some 55 to 60 years. And I think you would probably say we're now moving towards the final stage of that particular industry, which nevertheless has been very successful. There's two nuclear power stations have been just down the coast from me at Sizewell, the possibility of a third, and also 50% of the UK's offshore wind fleet is anchored off the East Anglian coast. When it comes to our energy supply strategy, basically there are three criteria, and I'll come on to a fourth in a minute, which dictate policy. And those are security of supply, price, and decarbonisation as well. And those are criteria that float around and are relatively fluid. And there is always a danger that as one rises in prominence, that you tend to get short-term strategies, and that is accentuated by governments which only tend to have a really short-term approach, probably looking no further than 5 years ahead, whereas energy strategy to be successful needs to have a long-term, probably 30 or 40-year approach. The fourth factor, which I do think we need to have in mind at this particular point in time, is the job creating opportunities that energy can provide. And very often those are in parts of the country where those jobs are needed. And so it ticks a box with the government's levelling up strategy. Moving on to what my views are as to what our strategy, the technologies it should include. And I'll just quickly run through these. Renewables, that's offshore and onshore wind, solar, hydro in certain parts of the country, not in the area that I represent, which is a bit too flat. Nuclear does, I believe, have an ongoing role, and the large-scale reactors we're looking at the moment can in due course pave the way for small modular reactors. Extracting oil and gas on the UKCS still has, I believe, an important role to play. An investment on the UKCS that can then lead on to opportunities which are important to decarbonisation, whether that's carbon capture and storage, and also the opportunities to use that infrastructure we've laid down over 50 or 60 years for the new kid on the block, if you like, hydrogen. Interconnectors also do have a role. And I'm looking at interconnectors for the Netherlands. I actually represent a constituency that is nearer to the Netherlands than a lot of other parts of the country. That is very important for transport fuels from Rotterdam. Norway is I would suggest, an energy ally, and there are opportunities in hydropower from there as well. I think the one prejudice I would just highlight is that I don't believe that there is a long-term future for fracking, and we can come on to that. That's onshore fracking, and we can come on to that in the discussion. I think it's important to work with communities, and I think in the past, energy strategies have failed where schemes have been imposed on communities, and communities need able to be part and parcel of the solution, and must get tangible benefits when a particular scheme is taking part in their area. And I think we also do need to unleash the opportunities for community energy, which really enables communities to have a important role. The final point I would just highlight is we focus on the supply side, but let's forget the demand side. There are some schemes which we've done well in the past, like the ECO and the CES. They need to be scaled up. More recent schemes, the Green Deal, the Green Homes Grant, they haven't gone so well. And we need to look at this. And I would also suggest we just need to look at our strategy with regard to the rollout of smart meters. So that's just a few comments from me, just to set the scene. Back over to you, Karl.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's very interesting insights and a good few things to return to in the discussion there later. But for the time being, Jess, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I must say there's some drilling going on just outside the office. So if you hear a pneumatic drill, please forgive me in advance. But I'm Jess Ralston. I'm from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Like Karl said, we're a think tank that aims to inform the debate around energy and climate issues. So I think I agree with much of what Peter said, in particular his last comment around the demand side measures within the strategy. And I think so far within the media and within the political sort of landscape, there's been a lot of focus around the supply side measures. And by that, I mean, more nuclear, whether or not the government will back more North Sea drilling and more renewables, which actually at the moment are acting to keep electricity bill rises to much lower levels than gas bill rises. If you have a look at the actual statistics, it's gas has gone up by 97%, whereas electricity has gone up by 54%. So you can see the tangible benefits there of more renewables. But what I'm going to focus on during these opening remarks is the demand side measures. And I'm going to focus specifically on energy efficiency. And Peter mentioned some schemes that have worked for energy efficiency in the past in the UK, but I think experts agree that insulating our homes, which are among some of the worst in Europe, is the biggest no-brainer possible. Limiting gas demand from buildings is not just a win-win, but it's a win-win-win. It really reduces our reliance on gas from places like Russia. It immediately lowers bills in the context of the cost of living crisis, and it means our leaky homes emit less carbon on the path to net zero. So there really are, a triple win there for energy efficiency. And experts agree that it is essential, but for some years, I think it's fair to say that it's sort of been forgotten or left by the wayside in favour of shinier, sexier solutions. But the potential is huge in the UK. For example, some analysis which we ran a couple of weeks ago shows that moving from energy performance certificate band D up to band C, which is the target the government has set for 2035, that actually reduces the home's gas demand by 20%. So you reduce the gas, the individual homes by 20%, and overall you cut the UK's total gas demand by 7%, or 15% of our net imports. And when you look at Russia, that accounts for 4% of our imports. It's clearly a huge step towards weaning ourselves off the gas. That is essentially funding Putin's war. And there are examples where energy efficiency schemes have paid dividends, like Peter said, in the UK and in Europe. So the UK's energy efficiency schemes in the noughties and in the 2010s were so successful that they reached a peak of 2.3 million installations a year. Yet after policies were slashed in 2013, by the way, causing the job losses of half the people in that industry, we've seen installation rates drop off by 95%. And since 2013, we've insulated just 2.4 million homes in total. And that is mainly through the Energy Company Obligation, ECO, which delivers measures into low-income households. And during the gas crisis, ECO will likely save these fuel-poor homes around £500 on their gas bill, which is obviously a huge part of the increase that they will see tomorrow when the gas price, when the price cap goes up. So ECO is a success, but it's on its own. And despite an uplift to the budget this year, which many fuel poverty groups have welcomed, it just won't deliver the scale of improvements in the non-fuel poor sectors. And they're all feeling the pinch as well. It's not just fuel poor homes, it's those that are on the edge of fuel poverty as well that will really feel the difference when the price cap goes up tomorrow. And we can look to our European neighbours for examples of how to get these schemes right. Germany has the KfW. I won't subject you to my German accent. That's just the shortened version, KfW. And they've had that for 10 years. And over those 10 years, it's had massive, massive impacts for jobs. So I think the latest stats say 900,000 jobs have been supported over the last decade or so of its running. And last year alone, it had more than 600,000 applications. So that just shows, when you stick with a scheme, it really can have massive impacts, not just for homes, but also for jobs. And in France, there's a scheme that was very much like the Green Homes Grant, but should we just say it was a little bit more successful? And it had over 380,000 applications in just 6 months. The key there being that it took just 11.5 days to get an application approved, which was, very different to what the Green Homes Grant timings were like. But I do think the government are starting to recognise the value of demand-side measures. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the spring statement last week, where it was encouraging to see that VAT will be slashed to 0% on energy-saving materials. But that will help to push those that were already considering these measures, perhaps over the line to get these insulation products in place. But there are still huge gaps in policy for the majority of households that simply can't afford that at the moment. And the Chancellor's statement really did nothing to help those who don't have funds in place. So, there's lots of things that the government could do in the energy security strategy to really build on what the Chancellor sort of left out. And that's things like, running a public engagement campaign around energy saving measures and how people can reduce their energy demand at home, because I think they all want to. All the polls show that people are concerned about energy bills and that they want to do something about it. But being given that information on specifically how they can from a trusted source like the government would be really powerful. And there's other options as well, like low or zero interest loans, perhaps offered by the new UK Infrastructure Bank, that could work to incentivise people to get these measures put in and ultimately save them money on bills, but also improve our energy security because we're not so reliant on gas from places like Russia. So I'll finish up now. I think I've spoken for quite a long time, but the same messages as how I started. Energy efficiency is a no-brainer. It's the area where is the most cross-industry, cross-party and cross-public support. And yeah, I just think what's not to like, really.
Thank you, Jess. That was a very insightful contribution on the demand side. Some fascinating stats in there. Hopefully we can return to some of that in the discussion. In the meantime, though, Adam, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Of course. Hello all, I'm Adam Bell from Stonehaven. As Karl said, I was formerly of Bays, and a lot of my former colleagues are currently running around Whitehall, desperately trying to get this strategy out the door, for which they have my complete sympathy. I agree with a lot of what both Peter and Jess have said, especially on with Jess's reference to a demand reduction campaign. I think that's an absolutely vital and easy win measure the government could take right now. That would help a lot of people before the coming winter. I want to pick up on something that Peter said, which I thought was really interesting and really crucial to how we respond to this crisis. He said that a real energy strategy looks 30 to 40 years in the future. And I think that's absolutely right. So the place where I want to start is by looking at that kind of long-term approach that's been taken by different places in previous crises. And the obvious place to start is the 1973 oil crisis, which happened in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, when OPEC opted to embargo nations that had supported Israel and reduced production, and this drove oil prices up to, well, they drove the quadruple. Now, there were lots of extreme short-term measures that came out of that. The UK decided to ban driving on Sundays, for example, but the longer-term approach different sorts of nations took to that immense price shock is, I think, really helpful when we're thinking about what the UK's energy security strategy should be today. So I'm going to pick on what we did, what France did, what Norway did, and what Denmark did. So we were lucky enough to have access to North Sea resources, as Peter has already said. That quadrupled oil price made drilling in the North Sea much more viable. We expanded, the scope of extraction to cover a whole new swathe of fields, including the 40s, and the tax receipts, especially during the 1980s, from those fields helped pay down public debt, and all that cheap gas helped spread central heating. It helped make our homes warmer and more cheap to heat. That cheap gas, again, in the 1990s, caused the dash for gas, which saw us in the UK power sector invest heavily in new combined cycle gas turbines, shoving some of the coal out of the market, and effectively leading us to abandon our nuclear build-out. Unfortunately, of course, as the North Sea has wound down, this has ultimately left us dependent upon imports of fossil fuels, and we are now experiencing amongst the highest wholesale power prices in Europe. France took a very, very different approach. The Messemer plan called for the entire country to run on nuclear power. I don't just mean the power sector. Messemer's vision was that they'd electrify their transport and their heat through a 200 gigawatts of fission plant. Obviously, that didn't happen, but the sheer scale of the build-out meant that France still has a very, very large nuclear fleet that has given them lots of export opportunities. The 4% increase in retail prices that French consumers have been exposed to, which is quite frankly nothing compared to what consumers in the UK have been exposed to, is as a consequence of that very large fleet being able to sell its power at a quite high wholesale price into the German market. And those revenues are being used to effectively pay down costs for French consumers. Now, Norway benefits from oil and gas too, but rather than spend it, put its tax receipts, take those tax receipts and just use them to pay down debt, decided instead to create a sovereign wealth fund, which is still creating a significant amount of value for the country. And they were lucky enough to benefit from very, very large hydropower resources. 95% of their power comes from hydropower, and Norway is extremely mountainous. This has given it incredibly cheap electricity to the point where Norway has, the debate around heat pumps has been going on the last few months, but Norway has already electrified most of its heat. And its per capita power demand is about 5 times that of the UK. Its wholesale power prices are still very, very low. I think they're about 90 euros per megawatt hour, even in the present crisis, compared to the 150 to 200 prices that the UK has been experiencing. Denmark, so at the start of the 1973 crisis, did rely extensively upon oil and gas for power generation. Now, given that it didn't have access to these resources natively, though it later discovered some fields in the North Sea, it opted to carefully husband those resources. This led to an extensive energy efficiency campaign, including upgrading its housing stock, but also completely changing the way urban areas source the heat for their buildings. Most of Danish urban areas are on some form of heat network that's powered by some form of combined heat and power plant that maximizes these sort of relatively limited resources Denmark had at that point. It also went to wind power very early, and it's now a net exporter of electricity too, and it benefits from relatively low power prices. Not as low as Norway, although Denmark has have an interconnection to Norway therefore benefits from those power prices, but its power prices are still about half of ours right now. Of course, the actual cost experience by the consumer in Denmark is a little bit higher, principally due to tax, but right now I think Danish consumers are probably better off than UK consumers, and it's not been, you haven't been able to say that much for the last decade. So what did this tell us? The UK took a relatively short-termist approach, and it did let effectively North Sea extraction rip and opted to, rather than reinvesting some of those revenues, to effectively use those in the short term to pay down debt. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our debt would have been higher if we hadn't done that, but it did mean that we didn't leverage our asset as efficiently as other countries have done. I think what we can learn from this is that countries that do have access to some sort of natural resource and have a plan to manage it and maximize its value, or in the case of a country like France, decide to go all in on the particular technology, seem to have come off better as a consequence of this crisis. So for us, this points to a number of interesting conclusions. So I think the Prime Minister has been in the FT mooting a target of 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. That's great. It's about using our wind resource, which as Peter said, we enjoy bounteous quantities of, but targets by themselves aren't necessarily a strategy. They are short-term. They're short-term, they're politically expedient. They're always wearing the clothes of long-term thinking. And now, nowhere they can have a simple target is an articulation of how we'll maximize the value of that 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. Peter referenced interconnectors. How do we ensure that we are able to export all of our additional power? How do we ensure that a lot of the value of our resource comes back to the UK? Right now, I think we have about 4 gigawatts of interconnection with a couple of extra gigawatts on the way. Those are relatively small pipes. There's going to be an awful lot of power looking to get out of them. A lot of those pipes are connected to France, which is a big exporter too. Again, I want to see government in its electricity security strategy thinking about how you maximize our resources. And part of that, of course, is reducing domestic demand, as Jess has rightly said. There's a big need to upgrade our housing stock, and also not just our housing stock, fund industry. Where it's using power or some other form of fossil fuel to ensure that those processes are as efficient as it can be, to replace capital stock wherever we need to, because we can't just assume that we can continue shutting down our manufacturing industry and therefore as a result drive down our overall costs. So that's what I want to see from the energy security strategy, an actual strategy, rather than necessarily just a laundry list of deployment targets. So in that regard, the fact it's taking longer to come out is probably welcome. If it's being used to enable the government to expand its thinking, and it's not just a delay as a consequence of cabinet infighting. I will leave it to our audience to judge which is most likely.
Thank you, Adam. That was very insightful. Lots of historical lessons to be learned and things to reflect on there. I think it would be really interesting to pick up from a remark you made and something Peter said earlier. So you referenced our limited interconnector capacity. And there was a story in the news quite recently about a planned new interconnector being foiled by planning permission concerns somewhere on the south coast. I forget where exactly. And Peter said it's really important to find a way to work with local communities in bringing energy strategy to fruition. And one of the major issues here, of course, is planning around onshore wind or new nuclear. So have the panelists got any thought on what are the best ways to engage with local communities and get them involved in securing our energy supply? Adam, would you like to start?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, I think I have a little bit of an extreme view here, which is that having spent a decade in energy and given the scale of the crisis that we're referring to, is it really appropriate and necessarily the same level of planning restrictions upon new development as we might otherwise have? I don't recall in the Second World War, the RAF needing planning permission for airfields, for example. We need these resources relatively quickly in order to offset the loss of access to certain chunks of the market that we otherwise would have had. At the same time, I'm conscious of the significant political cost associated with haphazard development. So I think there's a couple of things that you can do, especially when it comes to offshore wind. One of the biggest problems, and I'm sure Peter will recognize this as well, is that right now our approach to offshore wind means that for every farm you build off the coast, you need to build a new cable to the mainland. The landings of those cables, HVDC interconnectors, are quite big. They look like big warehouses sat on the coast. And where there's been a lot of offshore wind development, it's been a lot harder for local people to support it. there's an important role for our planning regime in requiring new offshore wind farms to connect to some form of new offshore infrastructure and offshore grid. And there's a role for government in ensuring that national grid is empowered to construct that.
If I agree with what a lot of Adam has said. I come at it slightly differently because I am a politician, which and I say that not in a party political colour hue, but in the fact that if people do not like something, they come beating the path to their MP, whether that is a nuclear power station, whether that is the for those stations in for the offshore wind, whether it's very large solar farms which are being planned at the moment. People tend not to like them. They don't like them if they are being imposed on them. And where that has happened in the past, they tend, you tend to have major difficulties and major challenges. I think what you need to do is where a community is having a is hosting a, whether it's a solar farm, a wind farm, or the substation, they need to be, dare I say it, well rewarded and compensated for that. I think the wind farm, the offshore wind issue, which Adam has touched upon, does very much, it's a very much, I focus on that at the moment because it's happening in my patch. And you could say I represent a constituency which will benefit significantly from the wind farms in terms of we have a operational port from which construction is taking place, and in due course the operation and maintenance will be established. But the actual connections go across some of my neighbouring colleagues' constituencies, and those are causing particular problems. The real problem at the moment is, Adam refers to an offshore grid. The trouble is, at the moment, the technology for doing that isn't there at the moment, and yet governments, have got those 2030 targets, which if we don't get on with it now with the wind farms, those wind farms that are seeking permission, we're not going to deliver. So in due course, rounds 4 of those of the offshore wind farms, yes, everyone must work together collegiately to come up with that offshore, or the connection, so you haven't just got the point-to-point connections, but in the short term, communities have got to be compensated for hosting these facilities.
Could I just mention a few things as well, Carl? I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But just some interesting stats that I came across the other day, actually, particularly around the planning issue. Now, I'm not an expert at all on the planning question or really how to interact with communities, but I did see that there's already 649 wind and solar projects that have planning permission in the UK. And if all of those were moved to, actually being constructed, it would save more gas than we import from Russia. So I think, there's this tendency to get caught up in the planning issues when really we've got ones that have permission. We just need to accelerate their investment and their construction in order to get them online. And just a few points around onshore wind, which has been very much in the debate over the past few days, really. And there was a survey done by the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department in the winter, so when the gas crisis was ongoing and people were talking about different solutions. And that showed that 80% of people support onshore wind. And there was also a secondary poll by Octopus Energy that came out recently that said, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was somewhere between 80 and 90% of people support onshore wind in their own community. So there's this attitude of, NIMBYism, people don't want it in their backyard. But I think the gas crisis is really turning that on its head. And I think that now more than ever, people do want to see homegrown renewables, especially in their local communities, because like Peter said, they want to be part, of that solution. So just some reflections there on where the public stands on these issues. And by the way, just to throw in that the same government poll found that only 17% of the public support fracking. So there's a clear difference there between fracking and onshore wind.
Thank you, Jess. I think that leads us on nicely to another question I had lined up. Onshore wind, offshore wind, there's a general consensus we need to build these out, find a strategy to hit these targets. But there is also a counter risk there potentially. If we're moving away from fossil fuels to reduce our independence on Russia, given, say, China's role in some of the supply chains for rare earth elements that end up in the turbines, in the magnets in the turbines, how do we avoid then becoming dependent on other sources which could cause trouble down the line? Adam, would you, Jess, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say a couple of things around this, because I think it is an important point, and the critical metals supply chain is something that's not new to the UK, or it shouldn't be new to the UK government, given that they commissioned a report into it almost 10 years ago around the supply chains of the rare earth elements and other critical metals like lithium and so on. So I don't think there should be an issue in having that longer term plan, because it's been on the agenda for quite some time, and it's a case really of acting on the recommendations of that commissioned research. And I was also going to say that, moving away from our dependence on Russia, and, you mentioned relying on China instead, but really metals themselves are infinitely recyclable. I studied geology, when I was at uni. So when they're recyclable like that, if you have the circular economy supply chain in place and you have the ability to recycle the batteries from the EV, production centres that we already have in the UK, creating recyclable, facilities there as well, where they can really do the full supply chain and then reuse them in their own batteries. I think that would be really powerful. And it's one of the things that could make the UK a leader, because every country in the world is going to have the same issues, right? As we move to renewables, we will be looking more at recycling metals and things. And if the UK gets ahead of that and does have these hubs where there's already EV supply chains, then it would make a lot of sense to me for us to lead the way on that.
If I may, I just want to say, first of all, that Jess is absolutely right. Recycling is going to be a big part of the way in which we manage our new minerals constraint. I think there's kind of a second half of that as well, which is how we access the minerals in the first place. There's something about how we approach these sorts of critical sectors a little bit more strategically. Historically, in precisely the way we've done with natural gas, we've assumed that world supplies and the market will drive our ability to access these resources. In the more deglobalized age, with our ability to access some of those markets potentially constrained, there's a need to think about precisely where those minerals are coming from and how we can ensure that UK industry gets access to them. I think in this case, this is an area especially where ESG thinking is really important, because as I'm sure many people on the call will be aware, practices around the extraction of some of these rare earth minerals, things like cobalt and so on, places like the Congo, are absolutely appalling. The governance of how the returns from these minerals are allocated is just terrible. There are conflicts around them. There's lots of deaths, lots of destruction, and so on and so forth. There's a strong role for the UK, and especially as we think about how we're going to utilize our aid budget, and thinking about how we can ensure that extraction happens in such a way as to comply with the best possible ESG guidelines, to ensure that UK mines can access lots of different sorts of finance, and ensure that we're delivering genuine value to the sorts of countries that we want to do business with, because that's where these minerals are.
If I could just touch, Karl, on you talk. I think there is, when I started off, I talked about the four criteria when you look at energy, and there's the three we normally talk about. But I think if we do this properly, there is an enormous jobs dividend in a lot of communities where those jobs are very, very badly needed, and that matches in well with the levelling up agenda. I think if we look at something like the offshore wind sector deal, it did very much focus on the importance of supply chain building and increasing UK content. I think it is important that that sector deals that aren't exactly vogue at the month are not sort of left on the shelf and gathering dust. I think they do have an important role to play, and I think developers need to be challenged regularly to make sure they keep to what their provisions and undertakings were, and those are regularly reviewed. I think increasingly these industries have got to look at it on a whole supply chain approach. Very much, if you looked in the past, if you had a challenge in the North Sea, the operators would say, right, how can I make the pip squeak with my supply chain? I think that approach has got to disappear, and you've got to look at it as a whole supply chain the approach on this. I think the other factor where over the years we have missed a trick, and if you look at this with in the oil and gas industry with fabrication, so much of our what was constructed and put up in the North Sea was sailed in from abroad. And when you looked at UK yards compared to yards, I don't know, in Singapore and in the Far East or whatever, there was just no way we could match and compete with them. And I think we do need to focus, and I think government are focusing on upgrading that ports infrastructure, because I think that putting that in place, it's going to make it easier to retain these jobs and the manufacturing, the fabrication parts of it, maintaining those in the UK.
Thank you, Peter. All right. So we're going to go over the questions from the audience in a minute, but before we do, and also because I know it's been asked, I think the topic of fracking. So do any of the panelists see any role for fracking UK shale gas in our energy supply future in the short term or the longer term, or is that a bit of a red herring?
Personally, I think it is a red herring, and to a large extent, we've been there, done that. I think the Cameron government, and I think there was perhaps a nudge and a wink from Barack Obama to David Cameron to say, come on, have it's done us a lot of benefits here in the States. Why don't you do it, Dave? And I think that the States is a very, very different place to America. To ourselves, we're much smaller. We're much more densely populated area. I was struck by there's a correlation actually. If you look at areas of outstanding natural beauties and national parks in the UK, and lay over that where our shale gas it is, where the resources are, there is a remarkable correlation between the two. And I think extracting shale gas from the South Downs is just not going to be practical. And of course, when you get up into the north, you are doing densely populated areas where this is deeply unpopular. And I do fear we're going up a cul-de-sac, and we've been up there once, and I think it would be unfortunate to go up that particular road again.
I mean, I agree with what Peter said. I would also note there's a very strong correlation between shale oil resources in the Wheel and Conservative held seats. So I think it's going to be politically very, very challenging anyway. The only thing that I would say is that fracking has become almost a bizarre cultural touchstone to a degree. And therefore, I think there's a case for revisiting some of the seismic limits just to put it to bed. Right now, fracking is only allowed if it doesn't cause any sort of disturbance in the Richter scale of about 0.5, which is very, very small. The sector, and I was working in Bays back when fracking was first tried, had pushed for a limit of about 1.7, which will still be noticeable, but not to the same extent. I think there's an argument the government should raise that limit back to 1.7 and see what the sector can do, which I would bet is not very much at all.
Yeah, I have to say, I completely agree with what Adam said just then about the political question being pretty difficult to answer on fracking. And like Peter said, there isn't much support for it in these local communities. I'm actually from Lancashire originally, and not too far from one of Cordrilla's sites. And I was telling somebody the other day that I've never seen such a community united in resistance against it. It was people from all walks of life, all ages, every background, and they were united by basically how much they disliked fracking. But there's a couple of reasons as well why I think it just doesn't make sense for an energy security strategy that is in crisis now. We're in a gas crisis now because of gas, and I remain unconvinced, as do many other experts, that digging for more gas will help. It certainly won't help with our prices because we are still tied to these international gas markets, and digging a little bit of gas from the UK, because let's face it, we don't have very much. It wouldn't make a blind bit of difference to the prices that we pay, and therefore our energy bills, which is the real crisis of the moment. So even in a best case scenario, looking at what the fracking industry itself has said it can produce, in the best case scenario, if the restrictions were lifted overnight and if there was no public resistance, which we know is not the case, they would still only be able to produce 5% of UK demand over 5 years. So it really is marginal amounts of gas that we're talking about, and it just won't make a difference to our energy bills at the end of the day. And you don't have to believe me on that. The Centrica boss, who is obviously in the gas industry, he himself said that there's just no merit in fracking in the UK. So I think, to be honest, the fracking question is really going nowhere because there's public resistance, there's political resistance, and there's industry resistance as well. So I don't see it playing a big role in the energy security strategy at all.
Thank you all. It's pretty firm scepticism about fracking across the board there, it seems. So now we're going to throw things open to the floor, take some questions. First one is from actually our own head of policy, Alex Morton, and he asks: given the energy crisis, isn't it a sensible, urgent measure to postpone, as far as it's safe, the planned closure of coal and nuclear capacity over the next few years? I think there's something like 8 gigawatts of capacity in total due to go offline by September 2024. So, Adam, perhaps have you got a view on this?
If you can postpone the closure of existing nuclear plants, then great. I think it's technically quite hard to do so, and you start incurring increasing costs the longer that you want to do it, and especially if you've already started shutting those plants down. When you shut down the nuclear reactor, you generally start by doing what's called poisoning the core, which means introducing a neutron-absorbing agent like boron into the mix. And this effectively means that the reactor is fundamentally ruined unless you drain it and extract every single reactor component and start again. I'm not quite sure whether we've done it with the existing reactors, and that's what the Germans have done to some of their ones that are coming offline. But again, it's not as easy as just flicking a switch. On coal, I think we have used coal over the winter. We are keeping the coal plants on for a little while longer, primarily through the capacity mechanism. They are likely to come off towards the middle of the decade. I'm unpersuaded, given that we did in fact import quite a bit of coal from Russia, that there's an energy security argument to be made for keeping them on the system much beyond that.
Yeah, I agree with what Adam said there around the nuclear and the coal question. I think when we're talking about immediate measures, this is exactly the time that we should be talking about energy efficiency and reducing our demand, because that is a short-term measure and it can influence people's bills pretty much overnight. So instead of fiddling around with nuclear or coal or rowing back on our environmental commitments, and as Adam said, we're not even sure if it's possible to to prolong the closure of the nuclear plant. So what we do know to be possible is insulating homes. So let's just get on with that and reduce our demand instead.
I think just commenting on that, I have to confess I'm not an expert in the coal industry, so so I don't know the full details of that. But from what I understand on nuclear, and as I said, I can't quote the precise period, but if we look at Sizewell B, I'm getting ahead of myself, Sizewell B, which was actually the last nuclear power station we commissioned in this country back in 1995, that may actually be the part of the problem where we are, in that nuclear has been part of our energy supplies since the 1950s. It's been very successful, and since then we'd had a regular conveyor belt of new power stations coming online, and we paused, and I think it was a most unfortunate pause for the past 30 odd years, and you're going to find the gap between Sizewell C and Hinkley C. Well, it's going to be 35 years, and that's part of the problem. But from what I understand, from what EDF tell me, that Sizewell B, it is possible to extend the life of that power station for about another 10 years. So it does have a role to play. Obviously, as we have fewer of these substations, these nuclear power stations online at the moment, there is less opportunity for it to play the key role it can play in the short term. And Jess is right, we do need to focus on the demand side as well.
On that note, we have a question I think would be really interesting to hear Jess's views on. Martin Kelly writes, electricity is only 20% of our energy use, yet much of the general discussion focuses on building electricity generation kit. How do we move away from using gas in heat and industry and oil in transport?
I think it's a brilliant question, and I think that is the crux of the issue, really, is how we do decarbonise these sectors, and particularly just focusing on homes for a second, you can move away from gas heating to various different technologies, but I think it's widely agreed within the energy industry that heat pumps will be the primary technology for most homes. Have some perhaps running on hybrid systems or biomass boilers and things, but heat pumps will be the key technology there. And actually tomorrow, the boiler upgrade scheme is being launched by the government, and that will give people a £5,000 grant to install an air source heat pump into their homes. And the hope there is that it will kickstart the supply chain in the UK and kickstart the installation industry to ensure that we can reach the target that has been set by the government already, which is 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028. So, there's ways that we can move away from gas heating, and we've got other countries that have already made huge strides towards that. France has had, millions of heat pumps installed over the last few years. And I think in Sweden, they've got 1.9 million, and Sweden is one of the coldest countries in the world. So you hear a lot of myths around heat pumps. They don't work in the cold or they're noisy or whatever. And in the UK, I think that's because it's a cottage industry at the moment and they're not very widespread technologies. But as they become more widespread, the costs will fall, people will get more familiar with them, and so on. And the same goes for vehicles. The person who answered the question mentioned oil for vehicles, and we've seen massive growth in EVs over the past few years, and the myths around EVs are now starting to be squashed. People no longer have this anxiety that they're going to run out of charge. People no longer think, where am I going to charge it, because there's widespread charging now around the UK. So I think as time goes on, we'll see this happen because that's the way the market is already going. But I think there are real opportunities for the government to kickstart that switching as well, like they're doing with the boiler upgrade scheme. I can never say that, boiler upgrade scheme. And there's other incentives that they could offer in terms of heating and in EVs as well. So I do think it's underway. I think the transition is happening, but I think there's options for the government to really boost that demand side, those demand side measures in the energy security strategy.
Thank you, Jeff.
I just picking up on that. I think, now don't get me wrong, I think heat pumps do have a very important and probably the lead role to play in heating moving forward. But I have a slight note of caution. I've been an MP for 12 years now, and when I first got into Parliament, if you like, I was wined and dined by the heat pump industry saying, this is the future, we really need to get on with this. And 12 years later, it remains, well, you might describe it, I think I'll use Jess's words, as a cottage industry. Now, whether that is because the government haven't put the right measures behind it, or it's a matter of timing, I'm not sure. And I think it does have a role. I would just also highlight that there will be a role for other technologies whether that is biomass. I think that in certain, particularly in rural areas, that may well have a role to play. We're putting a lot of eggs also in the electrification basket, and again, that will be the lead player. But it comes on, particularly when transport, and we don't quite know for certain the role that hydrogen can play. But I would suggest it would be folly to disregard that infrastructure that has been built, laid down in the North Sea, also on land as well, without actually fully sort of investigating, exploring that opportunity. And hydrogen may well also have a role to play in transport, whether that's maritime, trains possibly, and heavy goods vehicles as well.
I think that's absolutely right, Peter. And sorry, I know, Adam, you probably want to come in as well. But just to say, I think with hydrogen, absolutely, there's no sense in disregarding it now. Do those tests, do those safety tests as well, and figure out how much it's going to cost, and then we'll see if it makes sense financially for heating. I do think it'll be really valuable in heavy transport, maritime, and for industries as well. Obviously, fuel switching in the steel sector, for example, that's already happening in Europe, but it's not happening in the UK yet. So I do think hydrogen has a role. I think there's this kind of this fear in the energy industry that waiting for hydrogen to come online will just delay progress in the meantime. And I think while we have the solutions now, like heat pumps, let's get on with putting those in, and then we'll see what happens with hydrogen.
Just before Adam comes in, I'll just to get the dialogue going. There is a problem in energy strategy in the UK in that we technology hop. There is the nirvana of technologies ain't there. The danger is you find a new technology, you get so far, and you run into difficulties. Say, hang on, let's forget that one, move on to the next one. You then meet the same problems again, and the outcome is you've done nothing over a long period of time.
Thanks, guys. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you've both said. I think the area of difference I would pick up on is that, yes, you can see a strong role for heat pumps in the future, but going for heat pumps at the same time as going for EVs means that we need to build out an awful lot of additional infrastructure quite quickly. The way in which you size your heat pump, it's under current MCS regs, is you're normally sized against your peak heat demand day. So you buy a big heat pump to make sure you can cover at least 98% of your heat demand. Now, I think for me, this means that given that we already have a gas network, if you're rolling out heat pumps on the gas network, do you actually need to get rid of your boiler at the same time? Or could you buy a smaller heat pump or even a hybrid to provide you with that base load and some form of control system that can switch over between these sorts of heat sources depending on what is most cheap? It gives you the option in the future, of course, to have a smaller heat pump plus a hydrogen grid alongside. And if you look at the EV transition as well, the EV transition didn't happen with going to electric cars overnight. You got significant technology improvements through hybrid vehicles first, which improved battery tech and drivetrains too. Although heat pumps have been around for a while, I have a suspicion in the UK, given the state of our electrical infrastructure and given the state of our housing stock, there is an argument for starting smaller than the 100% solution that the government is looking at.
I'm glad we got onto hydrogen there, because that's answered another couple of the questions we had up, and also some general concern over heat pumps. Someone on a not dissimilar line asks, you have not mentioned solar power, which could generate a lot of electricity. We got any thoughts on the role for solar in the mix?
If I was staying in this house for longer than 5 years, I would put PV on my roof right now. It is an absolute no-brainer for anyone who owns their own house. The only challenge is, of course, that if you don't own your own house, then there's a chance that you might miss out. So I think there's a role for government in thinking about how it can improve access to PV more generally. And some local authorities have undertaken some interesting schemes working with landlords to ensure that everyone can benefit from what is now almost the premier way of keeping your energy bills down.
I just quickly, Carl, I have a confession to make, or a declaration of interest. I'm a farmer, and right outside my back door, there's a solar farm. So, and so I do think it has a role to play. It's certainly in East Anglia at the moment. There is very significant community kickback against some pretty large wind farms. There's one, I think, in the West Suffolk area that covers 2,000 acres. And that then raises the question of, you may be getting energy security, but you may be trading that for food security. So it has a role to play. And the obvious thing, as Adam has said, is on all our roofs throughout the country, wherever it is practical, we should be putting panels.
I was just going to come in and add some stats on solar. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I think it's one of the most popular solutions in terms of ones that you put on your roofs. One of the most popular solutions with the public. Over 80% of people are in favour of solar, and I think when you compare, those sorts of levels of public support to what people think about fracking and things like that, it does make a lot more sense to look at our renewable solutions instead of our fossil fuel ones. And yeah, I think, if there's a time to do solar, like Adam said, it's probably now.
Okay, and I think we have time for maybe one more question before we wrap up. So one thing we've had mentioned is skills and the potential skill gap in terms of meeting the needs for installing heat pumps, insulation, other measures on the demand side. But someone else points out there's potential opportunity there. And talking to Peter just before the panel, and he noted the FE bill going for Parliament at the moment. So what are the constraints there, and what are the opportunities there for skills, levelling up, and that side of things?
I think the opportunities are massive in terms of the jobs you mentioned, like heat pumps, like insulation, but also the engineering jobs that we need for wind farms, and the electricity technicians that we need for, like Adam said, building up our grid capacity and stuff like that. And I think, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier on, but I think it was Peter, and it says there's a huge link between the areas that are, part of the government's levelling up agenda and the areas that will benefit the most from the energy transition, and that's places like the Northeast, the Northwest. You've got industrial jobs in Port Talbot or in the Northeast that, more jobs will be created there if we switch those industries to being net zero ready. And I think that there's a huge missed opportunity, really, where people refer to it as the skills gap, when actually it's just actually upskilling people. And there's 140,000 gas engineers, for example, who have the basic skills, such as bending pipes, that they need to install heat pumps. It's about switching them over to the future industries and upskilling them in the process. And that's only a good thing. Creating more jobs and having more skills is only ever going to be a positive for the people who are in these communities. And I think that the Heat Pumps Association have said that their members can train 7,000 people a year. Octopus have said that they can train an additional 1,000 people a year. So that's already 8,000 heat pump engineers that can be trained every year. And those are good jobs as well. They're lifelong jobs. At the moment, people who are training to be gas boiler engineers probably don't even have that long to do that job, because those jobs are going to be disappearing. So, future-proofing these industries and making sure that people have good access to upskilling qualifications and courses is really important. And I think people want to do these jobs as well. People don't want to be stuck in a job that's in a dying industry. People want to have a job that's going to set them up for life and actually contribute to ending climate change.
I agree with everything Jess said. I just want to stand on the note of challenge here, almost not to what you've said, but what the government is seeking to do. Fundamentally, we need to reshape our skills landscape in the UK to get us ready for the transition. Right now, for example, it's very hard, if you've been working on the rigs for your entire career, to move over to working on offshore wind. You've got relevant qualifications, but they're not offshore wind qualifications. There's something about portability between different sorts of sectors that helps ensure that you can maximize your access to people with the right sort of skills. There's also something about right-sizing our skill requirements, the sorts of work that people are going to be doing. Right now, if you're doing any sort of energy efficiency intervention as a result of a relatively recent government regulation and how those are conducted, you don't need just to have the guys there installing your double glazing. You need to have the guys there to assess that it's been doing in a way compliant with the whole house model. Now, entirely in favor of whole house retrofits, but if you're just doing double glazing, you could probably do that with one fewer person. So there's something about making sure that our regulations are really just about getting things done as cost effectively as possible, so we can deliver as many measures as possible and ensure that we have the right number of people doing the right sorts of things.
I think very, very quickly, because I'm conscious we are fast running out of time, but I would agree with everything that Jess and Adam have said. On the supply, as far as supply is concerned, when we look at offshore wind, to transition from oil and gas with opportunities in nuclear, coming, representing the constituency I do, I sense that the building blocks are in place to seek to make the most of these opportunities. I think when it comes to the demand side, which again, there is enormous opportunities. The issue and challenge is that a lot of the key players here, the employers, are SMEs, and actually engaging with them and getting people to get involved, that is going to be a challenge. Hopefully, the skills bill, which I think will be receiving royal assent any day, through the local skills improvement plans, does provide the vehicle for the local players. And it's a question of not just business, not just chambers of commerce, but also local colleges, the local councils, and where you have the mayors and also LEPs, to actually get together to provide a strategy that is right for that particular local area.
Right, so I think we've hit our time now, but thank you, Peter, Jess, Adam. Some really fantastic insights, a lot for people to go away and reflect on there. Thank you for everyone who's viewed this and contributed with questions. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, follow CapEx on Twitter, subscribe to our emails, and keep an eye out for our future events.
Thanks, Karl. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks all.
Many thanks, everyone. I did lose the touch. I lost sort of communication about 10 minutes.